All right, well, thank you all for coming here today. I'm Einer, Elhauge. My topic is anti-competitive gerrymandering. Now, the term gerrymandering comes from the fact that in this very great state, in 1812, Governor Gerry signed a bill that redistricted Massachusetts and left one district in this shape that a newspaper compared to a salamander, leading them to call it a gerrymander. Now, turns out Governor Gerry was not the one who designed this redistricting, and in fact, he signed it reluctantly, saying that it was highly disagreeable. He was actually against political parties altogether when the Constitution was enacted, but he went along with it because his party was interested in doing it. He's also not the first to have gerrymandered, although they didn't call it that before, but Pennsylvania and North Carolina have done it since colonial times. Patrick Henry was accused of doing it in the very first congressional election, 1789, to try to defeat James Madison. But what strikes me looking at this salamander-shaped district now is how quaint it is to think that this counts as extreme gerrymandering. Because after all, the borders, it's kind of weird, but it does somewhat correspond to political subdivisions, and at least it resembles something. This is what modern gerrymandering looks like. Two districts in North Carolina resembling nothing so much as a psychiatric ink blot, and running and grabbing people from all kinds of places to put them all together. Modern gerrymandering is much worse, I think, than historical gerrymandering for a couple of reasons. One is just technological. We now have computer software that enables any controlling party to, with a click of the mouse, have the computer draw district lines that will maximize their partisan advantage given any margin for safe seats that they want. So basically, you set your margin of safety, say I want to win each district with just 55% of the vote, then it'll draw the line so you maximize the number of seats that you win and will pack your opposing party into the remaining districts. And the modern computer and technology can do it not only ward by ward, but house by house, block by block, and divide people up in these sorts of extreme fashions. So the gains are much bigger now. The second big change is a modern political development. There used to be a norm that said, well, you only redistrict every 10 years after the new census comes out. That has now broken down. Now states redistrict every election cycle. So every 2 years, they redistrict again to try to gain partisan advantage. And that's important because it minimizes an important risk. If you do it every 10 years, if you pick your margin of safety too low, a political shift over time could suddenly mean that what you thought were your safe seats are now seats you're barely losing, and there can be a big change. If you can fine-tune it every 2 years, you really reduce the risk of drift. So Justice O'Connor in the 1986 Bannerman case, which first said that these sorts of claims are justiciable about partisan gerrymandering, had predicted that, well, we really shouldn't worry about it because it's self-limiting. Well, unfortunately, that prediction was overturned by these modern developments, because if anything, the gains are bigger and the risks are much lower from gerrymandering. So what are some of the problems that gerrymandering might create? Well, one big problem is non-competitive races. The current congressional approval rating as of this week is down to 10%. The re-election rate of House incumbents is 95%. Now, I know everybody says people hate Congress but love their congressman, but there's something pretty extreme going on when you have this sort of juxtaposition. Now, that alone, though, is not a particularly new phenomenon. It's gone up and down, but one year in particular, 1988, the House re-election rate was 98%. And I picked this year because of the delicious fact that the re-election rate was actually higher than it was in the Soviet Politburo at the time. So extraordinarily high re-election rates. Now maybe though this just reflects the natural incumbency advantage. It doesn't have to reflect district lines. There's lots of other advantages that incumbents have: seniority, name recognition, political contributions. So it could reflect that. But consider this: the Senate also has a re-election rate, and it's pretty high, 82%. But that's significantly lower, 13% lower than the House re-election rate. And although it's bounced around over time, it turns out that this is pretty persistent. Over the average over the last 70-some years, the Senate re-election rate has been 12% higher than the House. What's the big difference? It's not the incumbency advantage. It's that the Senate doesn't have the luxury of drawing its own boundaries for states. Right? You can't change those every election cycle. They're fixed, whereas district lines for houses can be changed. All right, so this is an important topic, but it's not one I'm going to dwell on for the simple reason that the Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, has actually declared it not a problem, but a legitimate justification for drawing district lines. As it said, one way you can justify how you drew the district lines is that it protects incumbents. Instead, the concern has been about partisan bias. So if you draw your district lines in a way that equally benefits incumbents from both sides, that's okay under current Supreme Court doctrine. But there is a concern under current doctrine about partisan bias, drawing the lines in a way that doesn't protect just all incumbents, but advantages one party. All right, so a few examples from our latest election. So here we have the states in the House elections of 2012. The vote share is a share across the state of how many people voted for candidates from that party. So you can see in all these states, the vote share for Democrats was above 50%. The share of seats that they got, though, was way below 50%, 36% in Michigan, all the way down to 27 and 28% in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, making them the stars of the partisan gerrymandering world. They're the best at it, maybe because they've been practicing since colonial times, but they've got the most extreme. And perhaps also the most upfront about it. The North Carolina state senator says, well, we're in the business of rigging elections. All right, so there's some grounds for concern about how these lines are being drawn. So what's the problem? Well, the Supreme Court has basically said that we think this is wrong, but we're not sure what to do about it. So there's all 9 justices agree to the proposition it's wrong. The quotes at the beginning reflect a plurality of 4 justices, and Kennedy signed on to these claims, which were basically that they don't disagree that partisan gerrymanderings are incompatible with democratic principles, and they don't disagree that an excessive injection of politics is unlawful. However, they've basically divided the following ways. 4 of them think, 4 of the justices think it's wrong, but we can't figure out what to do about it. There's no administrable standards, therefore they think it should just be non-justiciable. Another 4 justices think, well, it's wrong, but we can think of administrable standards, so we should go after it. And in the middle, as so often, is Justice Kennedy, who's taken the view that, well, it's wrong, and we don't have standards yet, but I really would like one. So I'm searching for a standard. Can anybody please help a justice and provide a standard? So what's the problem? Well, what are the problems with the standards that the court has been thinking about? Well, one intuitive standard is, well, maybe your vote share should equal your seat share. Your share of votes should equal the number of seats, share of the seats of the House that you get, for example. Well, the trouble is that that's not really what districting, a single-member district voting is designed to accomplish. If you want to accomplish that goal, you'd have to have proportional voting, and it's just a different system with different goals that we have. In fact, district voting sort of inherently deviates from it. So one easy way to think about it is certainly if you had a uniformly distributed 51% majority across all the districts, 51% of the vote would translate to 100% of the seats. And that's viewed as unacceptable. You want the minority to have some representation in the legislature. It also turns out, perhaps more surprisingly, that even a random distribution of make small compact districts, if you randomly distribute them, if the state pot is big enough, you also get 200 seats with 51% of the vote. So basically, you need some non-random method of drawing district lines. And then the kicker is any non-random method you draw inherently benefits one party in some predictable way. So it's unavoidable to make a choice about this. And it's also unavoidable that it has some some partisan effect. There is no real neutral method for drawing lines. So that's problem one. Now, what about a simple standard like this? So, one standard was proposed in the Vieth case, said, well, it should at least be wrong when you get a majority of the vote and you get a minority of the seats. How about that as a standard? Well, the Vieth majority rejects it based on three grounds. So they say, well, it's really like proportional representation. There's no constitutional right to it. I don't think that argument's quite that strong because it's not the same as proportional representation. I'm not saying 60% of the vote should mean 60% of the seats. It's just one particular claim that when you get to an actual majority, you should get a majority. The other problems, though, are more telling, I think. One is that the votes are cast for candidates, not for parties. So that when we calculate, for example, in that last chart, the Democratic vote share, it's really a bunch of votes that are specific candidates, and people don't always vote along party lines. And another big problem, though, is that we can have the same sort of effect from nonpartisan gerrymandering, from drawing district lines in nonpartisan ways. And we have had this kind of effect. So it's not a very decisive test. Another problem the court didn't think about, but I think is a problem, is that any votes we get are going to reflect the districting lines that were drawn. So if you're an astute political party, you are not going to spend a lot of your resources running up the score in districts that you're going to win handily. You'll instead allocate the resources to try to win the close elections, which could result in a case where you get a majority of the votes, even the majority of the seats, even though you didn't get a majority of the votes. Okay, another approach has been to focus on the technique of packing and cracking. So what's packing and cracking? Basically, to pack a district is this technique of filling it with a lot of your rival party's supporters, cracking, and that basically so they waste more of their votes. Cracking is you split them apart enough so that they can't be a majority in districts. So these are the techniques used for partisan gerrymandering. The difficulty is that any district line that you draw always is combining some voters from parties and splitting some party voters, and it's always benefiting one party or another when it does so. So when we say we don't want cracking or packing, we can't really say we don't want any of it. Really the question is, we don't want so much of it that it has too big an effect. But how exactly are we going to figure out what that is? What standards are there for that the court was worried about? The other concern is that there are legitimate reasons to crack and pack. What are the legitimate reasons? Well, one is compactness is often cited as a goal, right? So we don't want this salamander-shaped thing. You want a nice, compact, pretty-looking district, very symmetrical. The difficulty is that like-minded people tend to live next to each other. So when you make it compact, you actually tend to pack them together. Other goals have this as well, trying to respect political subdivisions. People tend to move in the political subdivisions where they like what the local government is doing. Another goal of keeping religious ethnic communities together also has this effect. So there's lots of legitimate reasons for packing together. There's also legitimate reasons for cracking or separating party supporters. You may do it because you actually want to make the district more diverse rather than more uniform. Or maybe you want closer elections. You feel like it's bad to have elections that are too one-sided, so you make them closer by spreading people around. And it can also result from the other constitutional obligation, which is to equalize the population of different districts. So this, too, is rejected as a standard by the Vieth majority, including actually all these last three things, including Justice Kennedy, who's the key justice who is remaining out there looking for a standard. All right, so I want to propose a standard coming from antitrust law. Now, this is not as weird as it sounds. The antitrust analogy actually has a long history going back to John Hart Ely in constitutional law. And here I think it helps provide standards that courts have been using and are comfortable with, and that have natural analogs to partisan gerrymandering. The goal is similar in both cases. We're trying to preserve competition. There it's business market competition, here it's political market competition, but still competition. And we have similar problems. That is, there's no clear market share that we think a firm should have. When courts evaluate these things, they don't say, oh, well, trouble is your market share is disproportionate to the value of your product. We don't have any standard like that. And it's also understood that, well, firms are self-interested in their actions, just like parties are self-interested, and you can't really make them unknow the effects of their actions, just like you can't make parties unknow the fact that when they draw the lines one way, it's going to benefit them as opposed to another way. And so the approach taken in antitrust is instead to set some outer boundary to what you can do in a way that diminishes the competitiveness of your rival. And the standard is basically you prohibit firms who have monopoly power from engaging in exclusionary conduct. I think this actually fits better the original Bandemer standard. Bandemer is the first case that says justiciable, and it didn't really articulate a standard, but articulated a goal. And the goal was not some absolute standard like, well, you got less seats than you deserved, given the amount of vote. Instead, the standard was the party denied its chance to effectively influence the political process? So it has to be a pretty extreme reduction in the ability of the rival party to constrain the controlling party political power. All right, so how do we operationalize these tests? So the antitrust test is a two-part test. You have to have both monopoly power and exclusionary conduct. So what would count as political monopoly power? Well, I think it's when one party controls two things. That's to control the relevant political branches that are the ones who redistrict and draw the district lines. And sometimes that's controlling both houses of the legislature in a state. Sometimes it's that plus the governor, but it could suffice if you have a veto-proof majority in the legislature. The second, and this is an analogy to the antitrust standard, would be, do you have the power to price above competitive levels? Here I would say the standard is a demonstrated ability to gain a seat share that's greater than the competitive level. And what's the competitive level? Well, I think you can look at what seat shares have historically resulted from such vote shares in competitive political markets. That's in political markets where the lines were not drawn by partisan gerrymandering, but were drawn either by bipartisan gerrymandering or by some non-partisan commission. The second part of the test would be we have to have exclusionary conduct. So what constitutes political exclusionary conduct? Well, I think the district lines have to be drawn in a way that, one, has no objective justification. And I want to stress this is not a subjective intent test. It's looking at the lines and seeing, is there an objective justification that can fit the pattern of lines that have been drawn? And second, that the lines are drawn in such a way that the rival needs a significantly higher vote share to get seats than the controlling party needs. Note, this test is not, does the monopoly party totally exclude the rival party from having any chance to gain seats? And that's true in antitrust, too. In antitrust, the monopoly standard isn't, did you totally eliminate the rival? The standard is, did you significantly impair the competitiveness of the rival? And the reason for that in antitrust is that we want the rival to be competitive in order to constrain the monopoly power of the monopolist to raise prices. So if you impair the competitiveness of a rival, you lessen that constraint and increase monopoly prices. Likewise here, we care if the gerrymandering means that the rival party need a higher vote share to get seats. Why? Because when that happens, we've reduced the ability of the rival party to constrain the monopoly party from adopting positions that deviate from the wishes of the electorate. They have greater discretion to do so the more that they've impaired their rival. Okay, so how are we going to measure some of these things? First, political monopoly power. Here are some results from the 2012 election. The first two columns are like the ones we had before. We've got the vote share for the Democrats in each of these states and their seat share. But then the third column says, well, what was the expected seat share given what historically such a vote share has produced? Now, it's important to realize this is not linear, right, when you look at this chart. So, for example, for Indiana, when you get a 46% vote share, you don't expect a 46% seat share. You instead expect a 42% seat share. Likewise, for Michigan, when you get a 53% vote share, you don't expect a 56%, you don't expect a 53% seat share, you expect a 56% seat share. And this is just a well-known feature of voting by district is that you get disproportionate gains to going over 50%. You get more, if you have a big share, you're going to get more and more disproportionate gains in the number of seats you have for every vote share gain you have. So it's not linear, but it's also not unbounded. It's not the case that it's 100% when you have 52%. So there is some historical analogies that we can draw. Now these all happen to be Republican examples, but it should be emphasized that the Democrats have power too. Here's a lot of states. Oh, I forgot the last column. The last column is the difference. You can sort of get a sense of the power that a party has by how its actual the vote share for the rival party, how much it deviated from the expected vote share. Democrats have the same thing. Here it's measured positively, but you can see that when they control the districting lines, their actual vote share tends to exceed their expected vote share. And this is an important point. One thing it makes you realize is there's no hope of a political solution to this problem. Right? There's a collective action problem so that no state would want to give this up unilaterally, because why would you do it when the other side is doing the same? So they would have to all do it collectively, and there's no way to get the congressional majority that's benefiting from gerrymandering to do it, because they would be sacrificing political power. So this is one reason why I think it's not really a purely political question. It's got to be a constitutional question if we're going to hope for any limitation on this. All right, a few issues with measuring political power. So I relied on those stats because those are the ones publicly available, but I think really you want to deviate from them in a couple of ways. One, those baselines, the expected vote share baselines used there, were just based on all states, including states that use partisan gerrymandering. So if you really want to know is, well, what's the expected vote share when there's non-partisan or bipartisan gerrymandering rather than partisan gerrymandering? So in some ways, those vote shares are already distorted by the presence of gerrymandering. So you really want to restrict your baseline to cases where the vote share came from historical examples where there was bipartisan or nonpartisan districting. So in some ways that suggests that we've actually underestimated the partisan effect of gerrymandering. But the second factor cuts the other way. I think the figures presented in that table were averages. And really, there's a range of results. You can't, it's not like it neatly always leads to the fact that 46% vote share always leads to 42% seat share, because there's a natural range because voters are distributed differently geographically in different states. So I think you'd want to check out what the range is and see whether you're above the top of the range. Another important point to note, though, is that power cannot be enough. It's not enough that you're exceeding your expected seat share for a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned already, even in nonpartisan or bipartisan districting, there are legitimate reasons to pack and crack, and those can also lead to this kind of deviation from historical standards. You can also drift away from the baselines without any redistricting. Why is that? Well, not only are people already tend to live next to like-minded people, but they tend to move closer to like-minded people. In fact, if you've read the work of Charles Thabot, it's part of one of the economic theories is, in fact, that that's how we assure that local governments operate effectively, is that people can exit the ones that they don't like what they're doing and move to ones that are more similar to their political tastes. So people tend to concentrate with like-minded people. And in fact, this is a factor that has been particularly harmful, apparently in recent years, to Democrats. There also can be just shifts in party popularity in various states that can flip the results. And the 52% seats have been one way, now go 52% the other way, if there's been a particular kind of shift. So I think this is one reason why power of this sort can't be alone enough. You've got to have the control of machinery, and you've got to have my next factor, which is exclusionary conduct, which is also consistent with the Vieth Court's rejection of the claim that winning a majority of the vote, you can't assume the majority translates, majority vote translates into majority of the seats. Okay. Now, in terms of administrability, one might understand, well, this is not easy standard. I don't think it's going to be crystal clear always, the application of this. But I think it actually maybe compares favorably, or at least is no less administrable than the antitrust standard, which asks, does a firm have a substantial degree of power to raise prices over the competitive level? You have similar problems there of identifying a competitive level. Only sometimes even harder because you can't observe it because you might have markets that have never been competitive. And there's a substantiality requirement. And yet the courts feel comfortable applying that all the time. Here's some numbers to illustrate why we can't assume that power is enough. Here are the 2012 results in bipartisan or nonpartisan gerrymandered states. And you can see even in those states, in the 2012 elections, the Democrats suffered because of, I think, the natural effects, probably this concentration effect I mentioned before, where they tend to move to like-minded people in urban areas. So urban concentration has been a problem for Democrats recently. Okay. Last factor is exclusionary conduct. So how can we figure out what constitutes exclusionary conduct? Well, one is this lack of an objective justification for the way the district lines were drawn. Again, I want to emphasize it's not a subjective intent test. One thing the Supreme Court has been harshly critical of is these subjective intent tests, because you never know what a group of legislators intended. They all have different views, very hard to ascertain. That's not the test. The question is, given the pattern of lines, does it fit this objective justification? Another concern the court has, obviously, is that there can be an overlap, right? I said there's legitimate reasons to pack and crack, so they thought you'll always be able to come up with an objective justification. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case, though, because if you have some particular justification, for example, you say, well, I want to preserve communities, but you look at the pattern and you realize, well, they only preserve communities when it benefits one party, but not when it benefits the other party, then you can tell that that's not really the objective justification explaining the pattern of lines that are drawn. And second would be the test says, well, the rival party would, given the district lines, have to need a significantly higher vote share to gain any number of seats than the controlling parties need. And there's actually turns out to be a neat mathematical way to try to calculate this. You basically ask, are the lines drawn in such a way so that the rival party has significantly more, quote, wasted votes? So what's a wasted vote? Basically, a wasted vote is any vote you cast for a losing candidate, because none of those, in the end, affect the outcome, and any votes cast in excess of what the winning candidate means. So basically, in any election, 50% of the votes are, quote, wasted in this fashion. But the question is not, are we wasting votes? The question is, are the lines drawn in such a way that one party is wasting a whole lot more votes than the other party? And this corresponds to the packing and cracking. If you're wasting a lot more for a losing candidate, you've been cracked more. If you're wasting a lot more on a winning candidate because you're having packed together, you're packed more. So you take the difference between them and you divide it by the total number of votes, and then you can sort of figure out what one article, Stephanopoulos and McGee, proposed this, called the efficiency gap. As what's the gap in the way that a party's abilities to translate votes into seats, and you can figure out as a percentage of the overall vote. And the nice thing about that is it gives us some numerical standard that we can then objectively apply to some court-set threshold. So part of the court's concern is, how can I tell what's too much packing and cracking? Nobody's given us a standard. Well, here you can have a number. You can say, well, if the efficiency gap is 5% or more, for example, then that's excessive partisan gerrymandering. Now, one may wonder, is it plausible to think that the court is going to adopt lines like 5%? Well, in the cases involving one person, one vote at the state level, they've in fact done that. They've adopted, it's a 10% difference test. You can't deviate more than 10% in population. After initially just sort of not really saying what the standard was, they went through a long history, said, well, we just know this is too much, but eventually they settled on 10%. So I don't think it's implausible to have the Constitution adopt some sort of numerical standard, as antitrust often adopts. All right, now it's important to recognize, though, that this, I think, is not enough, though. This sort of asymmetry in wasted votes isn't enough. Why is that? Well, look at some election results recently in terms of what the results were in terms of which party gained the most from wasted votes. In the recent 2012 election, the Republicans had a big gain. So the red is the areas where the Republicans controlled the gerrymandering, and they obviously got much bigger advantage from wasting the votes of their rival than the Democrats did. Back in 2010, it was actually the Democrats that had got the biggest partisan advantage from wasted votes. But then look at 2008. What this shows is that the results actually can be similar even from bipartisan, nonpartisan gerrymandering. As in 2008, the Democrat votes tended to be more wasted, whether it was gerrymandered by the Republicans or the Democrats or a nonpartisan or bipartisan commission. Why is that? Well, it's that factor I mentioned before, that there can be legitimate reasons to pack and crack, and that there can be drift. People move into like-minded districts, and certainly in 2008, the Democrats suffered more from this phenomenon, and we can have shifts in party popularity that change the effects. So I think these are some of the reasons for which, in the most recent case to think about this, the LULAC case, Kennedy sort of said, well, I'm attracted to the symmetry idea, but it can't alone be enough. Now, it's a different, actually, symmetry method that he looked at and he rejected. But one, and I'm going to get into that in just a second, but one important thing he said is, well, it can't alone be enough because you could have it for these sort of legitimate reasons. And I think that's one reason why the antitrust test is good, because you add the lack of an objective justification and the monopoly power screen. So asymmetry isn't alone enough. So what's this alternative asymmetry test? Because one of the striking things in the LULAC case is that Kennedy basically said, well, this sounds promising, asymmetry as a test, but here are the problems in addition to the fact that it didn't seem to be alone enough. He was presented with a different asymmetry test. So the asymmetry test he was presented with said, well, let's take the current vote results and hypothetically shift them so that each party gets 50% of the vote. What are the results of doing so? Does it benefit one party more than, does one party get a bigger share compared to the other party when we shift it to 50%? So that test has various disadvantages compared, I think, to this wasted vote test. One that Kennedy pointed out was it was counterfactual, as you're asking what the partisan advantage would be in a state of affairs that actually has not happened, where each side is getting 50% of the vote. What you'd really like to know is what's the partisan advantage given the actual way votes are casted. Second problem he pointed to is it seemed to adopt a relatively arbitrary assumption that the swing in this hypothetical world would be uniform in all the districts of a state. And that just doesn't really seem to correspond to reality, because likely swing voters are not distributed equally across districts in states. And then in a lot of states, the gap is so big between the parties, it's implausible you could ever have a swing that would bring you to 50-50. In fact, this method, the authors of this kind of method say you can't even apply it to states who have a big vote gap. So these are all reasons not to apply it. Another big reason, I think, though, is because it's put in a hypothetical, you can actually have the opposite results of this wasted vote test, because they're focusing on what would be the partisan advantage in a hypothetical state of affairs, but in the actual state of affairs, you can have a different partisan effect. So anyway, so I think there's at least some signal from Kennedy that he's interested in a general idea, although not that particular instantiation of an asymmetry test, but changing it to this asymmetry test and combining it with other traditional analogs to an antitrust monopolization standard could solve the problems that Kennedy has observed about the current proposals. So I think at this point I'll take questions people may have.
Einer, what do some other countries do which don't have this problem? And what is the result?
Yeah, I haven't investigated that. I mean, some countries I've seen do have just commissions decide all the lines. I think others have similar partisan gerrymandering problems. I haven't investigated the constitutional doctrine of other countries to see whether any of them have imposed constitutional limits. Does anybody else know what other countries have done?
My question is, what do the nonpartisan commissions that we were saying we were looking at what nonpartisan or bipartisan gerrymandering commissions do? So what do nonpartisan commissions look at? What are the factors that they use to determine their districts?
Well, so it's not clear. So part of the problem is there's a series of factors, and they often conflict with each other, right? So those legitimate reasons often lead in opposing directions. So they weigh them together. They're not supposed to think about the partisan effects. There's one great paper I read recently where somebody who was appointed to one of these drew all the lines, and then afterwards one party came over and thanked them profusely for having given them such a partisan advantage. So, because sometimes when you do things, compactness has been one big standard that people have adopted. There are mathematical ways to figure out how compact a district is. But compactness can exacerbate the problem, right? Because you're packing together voters from one district, and so you're increasing the partisan advantage to the other side often. So they try to draw lines, I guess, without thinking about the partisan effect, but that doesn't mean they're not having a partisan effect, and that it may, in fact, be a significant partisan effect. Which is one reason why, I guess, I've titled this talk Anti-Competitive Gerrymandering, not Partisan Gerrymandering, because it seems to me, in fact, it's inevitable that you have a partisan effect from any district line drawing. And so we can't just ask about, does it have a partisan effect? We have to ask, has it hampered the competitiveness of the rival party in the state in a way that leaves the majority less constrained?
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the relationship of gerrymandering to some of the non-first-past-the-post voting systems that districts in the United States are experimenting with, and how the two can work, how your suggestions can work together with these, or work against these to alleviate the ills in question.
Well, I think we'd have to change our laws, because I think right now the Congress can regulate this as well. And so far it's adopted single-member districts is the one limitation that they've adopted. They used to have other limitations historically, whether they had to be contiguous or some sort of compactness test. So Congress has from time to time regulated. But I think it would be hard, unless we change the federal law, to have proportional representation, for example, in a particular state. Are there other first past the post methods, other methods other than first past the post you were thinking of?
Not in congressional elections, but in a lot of local or state legislative elections. You have Minneapolis and St. Paul adopting instant runoff voting. You have California adopting nonpartisan primaries. And other things are getting traction elsewhere in the United States.
Yeah, I think those are quite helpful, and they may help with different things. So I think nonpartisan primaries may help with the problem that politics becomes more partisan because what matters is winning a primary more than the general election when there's a lot of safe seats. So I think it's a useful corrective to that problem. Interesting, when I first started this, I thought that gerrymandering was exacerbating the partisanship problem, but turns out that the empirical evidence doesn't support that. It's been just as partisan before. The Senate has increased in partisanship as much as the House. So there's not a great deal of evidence that gerrymandering is exacerbating that particular problem. But I think it is, and it's also not entirely clear theoretically that it is a problem. I mean, some people worry about diluting people who have strong views to favor moderate sort of views. I tend to think it has been a problem and that those could be useful solutions to that. But it's a different problem than the partisan bias problem.
Hi, I'm wondering if you've run this wasted vote model on the states that you showed earlier. You saw like with the expected vote share, you might see like a 15%, 20%. I'm wondering how your wasted vote model maps on to that predicted model and how many states we see that are at, say, 5% or 10% wasted vote like rate.
I haven't run those numbers yet. I mean, the wasted vote model has been run on all the states in this article I mentioned by Stephanopoulos and McGee. So if you look at that in 2015 Chicago Law Review, you can get those results. I haven't yet run the numbers for the comparison model. So far, we have those figures that I pulled, but they're only for 1 year, and I think they're not quite right because they're an average rather than a range, and they include gerrymandered historical baselines. So that remains to be done.
So when you're looking at the antitrust law, I think one of the best solutions is just you hope that the industry has enough firms that the industry will just be naturally competitive. But if you if you were to treat elections as a marketplace, there are really two products in the market, the Democrats and the Republicans. So isn't part of the problem just inherently the fact this is a duopoly, and no matter what you do with anti-competitive or gerrymandering rules, there will always be some level of fairly substantial anti-competitive behaviors coming from these parties.
Yeah, I think that reflects a more fundamental choice between first past the post single-member districts versus proportional representation. So if you really want to have multiple parties, you have to move to proportional representation method. A first past the post method is inherently going to drive the electorate towards two parties. Now, there's advantages to that. Some of the advantages are, well, when you've got one majority, you can tell who to blame when things go badly. And with fractured government, it's harder. It's sometimes harder for them to get together and do stuff in fractured parliaments. And it leads to more stability. So, I think we've weighed those so far in our country and said we want single-member district voting. I don't in this paper have anything new to contribute to that debate.
It seems to me that the constitutional analysis of the drawing of these district lines could focus on the effects that seems like you presented here, but couldn't the analysis also focus on the process that is used to draw the lines, and why don't you think that that would be a better touchstone than the effects of the line drawing?
Well, I guess in some ways it does at least include the process, right? So one important feature to my test is that it has to be the case that the controlling party that benefited controls the relevant branches. So it wouldn't, if there's bipartisan or non-partisan process, then there wouldn't be any review at all. You inherently get out of it under this test. Now, you could adopt a theory that, well, we want to always have non-partisan commissions or whenever there's partisanship to eliminate any risk of partisanship. I think so far it's hard to get given the existing precedent, to get a constitutional doctrine like that. I mean, the court seems quite comfortable with the notion that historically we've always had the legislatures district for themselves. So to say that it's unconstitutional for them to be involved seems like would be an extreme conclusion historically and quite deviant from the precedent. So it is a possible solution. And I think actually one interesting thing is it could be the remedy in these kind of cases. Like four cases where one finds that the gerrymandering has been so partisan that it leads to these kind of anti-competitive effects. There's a question of, well, what remedy do we use? Then we set them aside. I think the remedy, a natural remedy would be to say, well, in those cases at least, we'll have to have some sort of nonpartisan way of drawing the district lines. But I think for it to be a categorical constitutional rule, it'd be very hard under current doctrine, and no hope for, if you favor that approach, no real hope to get there from the current set of precedent.
Might we not have a mixed system where the districts are multi-member districts with proportional representation, but it's not the whole state? I gather in the early history of the United States, many states were multi-member districts with one election. We could have that, and that would, and then you could decide, well, we'll have 5 districts, each of which will elect 3 people on a proportional I mean, then there's every mix and match possibility, and that's one of them, isn't it?
So you could do that. I mean, obviously, Congress would have to amend the federal statute, but Congress could do that. And then I guess the question is, would they impose it on the states, or would the states voluntarily do it? I think one difficulty with it might be is that the political advantage of the small states would be exacerbated. If you're a single member, some states, for example, only have one member of the House of Representatives, so majority gets 100% naturally in those. Huge states like California, you wouldn't have as much partisan edge. So the Democrats have a majority in California, but their seat share edge would be much smaller if you required proportional representation. So they might be more reluctant to do it. You'd have to sort of, some states, if they're doing it on their own, would be unilaterally disarming the majority party in that state. So it might be that Congress would have to impose it, and it has distributional effects across the states that might make it unlikely. But certainly, you're right, Congress could do that. If we wanted, we'd have in-state proportional representation for members of Congress, and certainly for the state legislature, each state could do it if they wanted to.
Some do, I think.
Proportional? Oh, yeah, multi-member districts, but with proportional representation?
Massachusetts, Cambridge has proportional representation.
Yeah. I mean, one problem with the number of seats in even beyond the one-seat states, it gets lumpy. If you have 5 seats, it goes in increments of 20%, and so proportional representation is, not going to map on as neatly as when you have huge parliaments, and you can have it map more closely.